and welcome to our third session on investment appraisal. Now let's look at our session overview and the objectives for this session. Now, a successful firm is normally or considered as one that consistently selects value creating projects. Now, what it means by value creating projects are the projects which bring in more than it costs the firm to embark on. Now, this competence ensures that the firm always embarks on investments, therefore that brings it more than it costs the firm. And so we're going to use this session to look at the techniques employed in the capital project selection process, and then also look at the strengths and weaknesses of the various tools. At the end of the session, students should be able to compute what we refer to as a payback, the discounted payback, understand its shortcomings. In general, students should have a fair understanding of the typical classes of investment appraisal techniques, which fall into the main categories of discounted cash flow techniques and non-discounted cash flow techniques. So you should also be able to compute the internal rate of return profitability index, understanding their strengths and weaknesses, and be able to also work with the NPV, understanding why it's normally considered the best decision criteria. And also finally we'll look at accounting rates of return and their shortcomings. Now let's start by looking at the main categories. We have non-discounted cash flow techniques, which normally are made up of the payback period and then the average accounting rate of return. And for the discounted cash flow techniques, we have the net present value, the internal rate of return, the profitability index, and the discounted payback. So we're going to start by looking at the non-discounted cash flow techniques. What we mean by non-discounted cash flow techniques, in reality what it really means is that in terms of the valuation process, we do not discount the cash flows that are being used. In essence, we use the raw accounting values. And so one of the first ones in this regard is the average accounting rate of return, which is normally captured as the average net income over the economic life of the project divided by the average book value of investment. Now, it is quite attractive, but it's quite also fatally flawed. Now, why is that? Its ranking criteria and minimum acceptable criteria are normally set by management, and this is normally quite arbitrary. Now, let's look at an example. Suppose that an investment requires 240 USD, and then it has a lifespan or economic life of 3 years. So this is captured as 0.1 year, 2 year, 3. Now these are the financial statements over the period. And so based on that, we realize that net income for year 1 is 105, for year 2 is 30, and for year 3 is 0. Now, average net income over the 3-year period, for which means we're looking at the average annual net income, will be the 3-year net income divided by 3, and that takes us to an average value of 45. Now, this is the initial investment required to set up, and then the closing value is captured as 0, meaning it has no scrap value at the end of the day. So the beginning value plus the ending value divided by 2 tells us the average investment, and so then the accounting rate of return is captured as the average annual net income divided by the average book value of investment, and that gives us an average accounting rate of 37.5%. Now, if this happens to be higher than the cutoff that has been set by management, then this investment is considered viable and embarked upon. Now let's assume that we require an average accounting rate of 25, therefore. It means that if we to use a FX example, it means that we qualify. Now, if this is another example where we have average net income over a 3-year period, the annual piece to be 15,340, and an average book value of investment of 72, then it means at a rate of 21.3, though profitable, we are likely to reject the investment because it falls short of the required rate that has been set by management. Now, how do we test the decision criteria on the average accounting rate of return? To be able to determine whether it is the best, you normally may want to ask yourself a few questions. Does the rule account for the time value of money? Obviously, it does not. Does it account for the risk of the cash flows? It does not. Does it account or does it provide an indication about any increment in value? We may not be too sure. And then should we consider the rule as our primary decision rule? I believe you'll be the best judge of that, because with its flaws, it means that at any point in time, you could be embarking on an investment that has serious problems. Now let's move on to look further. So definitely there are disadvantages of the accounting rate of return. First and foremost, it ignores the time value of money, which is a very important aspect as far as investments are concerned. Now, it also uses a very arbitrary benchmark cutoff rate set by management. What may influence that may not necessarily be based on the risk profiles, or and usually the values therefore are also based on book values and not necessarily on cash flows and market values, which may be misleading. Now, that doesn't preclude that it hasn't got advantages. Now, accounting information is usually easily available, and so that makes it very easy to come by, and then it's also very easy to calculate and to understand, and hence those are the main advantages. But its disadvantages sometimes and to a large extent negate some of the advantages, but it does not preclude that you cannot use that in testing before moving on to more advanced versions of investment appraisal methods. Now let's move on to the payback period. Now this, typically by its terminology, is trying to find out how long the project will take to pay back its initial investment. So here the focus is how soon we are going to recoup our initial investment. So we look at the number of years to recover the initial cost, and the rest of it, as we may say, is history. Now, how do we set the minimum criteria? Normally this will be set by management in terms of how long they wish to wait to be able to recoup the initial investment. And when it comes to ranking, that is when you have a number of projects to pick from. How do you rank them? That criteria is also set by management, and it's not always standardized across units. It may be quite arbitrary even within units of a similar or the same kind of business. Now, the payback method. The main disadvantage is also like the accounting rate of return. It ignores the time value of money, and normally it ignores cash flows after the payback period, for which reason sometimes it makes it more biased against long-term projects, because certain long-term projects may actually be offering very good return cash flows after the payback has been attained, but may be rejected because it takes much longer to pay off. But then a project that returns a lot of money in its early stages may be accepted even when it may have problems in the latter stages. Now, of course, another disadvantage is that it requires arbitrary acceptance criteria, and also a project that may be accepted based on the payback criteria may actually not have a positive NPV, which then negates the whole purpose of creating value for shareholders. Main advantages: it's easy to understand and it's biased towards liquidity, meaning that it's biased towards projects that easily bring in or quickly bring in cash flows. Now, thank you. We have come to the end of the non-discounted cash flow techniques. We move on to the discounted cash flow techniques in our next session.